Magnifizenz, meine Damen und Herren. Der Satz der Identität lautet nach einer geläufigen Formel A gleich A. Magnificent, ladies and gentlemen, the principle of identity.
What you're about to hear is something I had a lot of fun putting together. It was a costly expenditure, and I don't think it's perfect. In fact, you'll see for yourself. It's coming along, this technology, but it's far from really being there, right? But hey, Heidegger would not approve either way, I don't think. I don't think he liked English very much, and he certainly would not have loved AI. But, you know, we're in this, fully enframed as we are. Being in the world is already shattered. So what are we supposed to do? Well, might as well have a little fun. So, yeah, I hope you enjoy it. I hope you get something out of this. It's pretty cool for what it is. Enjoy.
The usual formulation of the principle of identity reads A equals A. The principle of identity is considered the highest principle of thought. We shall try to think about this principle for a while, for we should like to find out through this principle what identity is. When thinking attempts to pursue something that has claimed its attention, it may happen that on the way it undergoes a change. It is advisable, therefore, in what follows to pay attention to the path of thought rather than to its content. To dwell properly upon the content would simply block the progress of the lecture. What does the formula A equals A state, which is customarily used to represent the principle of identity? The formula expresses the equality of A and A. An equation requires at least two elements. One A is equal to another. Is this what the principle of identity is supposed to mean? Obviously not. That which is identical in Latin idem is in Greek to orto. Translated, to afto means the same. If someone constantly repeats himself, for example, the plant is a plant, he speaks in a tautology. For something to be the same, one is always enough. Two are not needed as they are in the case of equality. The formula A equals A speaks of equality. It doesn't define A as the same. The common formulation of the principle of identity thus conceals precisely what the principle is trying to say. A is A. That is, every A is itself the same. While we are circumscribing in this fashion what is identical, we are reminded of an old word by which Plato makes the identical perceptible, a word that points back to a still older word. In the dialogue, the sophist Kash, 254d, Plato speaks of stasis and kinesis, rest and motion. Plato has the stranger say at this point, "Ukun afton ekaston tuin mendioin eteron estin afton." Each one of them is different from the other two, but itself the same for itself. Plato doesn't just say ekaston afto tafton, each itself the same, but says ekaston iafto tafton, each itself the same for itself. The dative iaftu means each thing itself is returned to itself, each itself is the same for itself with itself. Our language, like the Greek, offers the advantage of making clear with one and the same word what is identical, and again clarifying that word in the unity of all its various forms. The more fitting formulation of the principle of identity, A equals A, would accordingly mean not only that every A is itself the same, but rather that every A is itself the same with itself. Sameness implies the relation of with, that is, A mediation, a connection, a synthesis, the unification into a unity. This is why throughout the history of Western thought, identity appears as unity. But that unity is by no means the stale emptiness of that which in itself without relation persists in monotony. However, to get to the point where the relationship of the same with itself, which prevails in that identity which was already implicitly present very early, emerges as this mediation in a decisive and characteristic way, and where an abode is found for this radiant emergence of mediation within identity, Western thought required more than 2,000 years, for it is only the philosophy of speculative idealism, prepared by Leibniz and Kant, that through Fichte, Schelling and Hegel established an abode for the essence, in itself synthetic, of identity. This abode cannot be demonstrated here. Just one thing we must keep in mind. Since the era of speculative idealism, it is no longer possible for thinking to represent the unity of identity as mere sameness, and to disregard the mediation that prevails in unity. Wherever this is done, identity is represented only in an abstract manner. Even in the improved formula, A is A, abstract identity alone appears. Does it get that far? Does the principle of identity really say anything about the nature of identity? No, at least not directly. Rather, the principle already presupposes what identity means and where it belongs. How do we get any information about this presupposition? The principle of identity itself gives it to us. If we listen carefully to its keynote, if we think about a keynote instead of just thoughtlessly mouthing the formula, A is A, for the proposition really says, A is A. What do we hear? With this is, the principle tells us how every being is, namely, it itself is the same with itself. The principle of identity speaks of the being of beings. As a law of thought, the principle is valid only insofar as it is a principle of being that reads, to every being as such there belongs identity, the unity with itself. What the principle of identity, heard in its fundamental key, states is exactly what the whole of Western European thinking has in mind, and that is the unity of identity forms a basic characteristic in the being of beings. Everywhere, wherever and however we are related to beings of every kind, we find identity making its claim on us. If this claim were not made, beings could never appear in their being. Accordingly, there would then also not be any science. For if science could not be sure in advance of the identity of its object in each case, it could not be what it is. By this assurance, research makes certain that its work is possible. Still, the leading idea of the identity of the object is never of any palpable use to the sciences. Thus, what is successful and fruitful about scientific knowledge is everywhere based on something useless. The claim of the identity of the object speaks, whether the sciences hear it or not, whether they throw to the winds what they have heard or let themselves be strongly affected by it. The claim of identity speaks from the being of beings. However, where the being of beings appears most early and most authentically in Western thought with Parmenides, there speaks to αυτό, that which is identical, in a way that is almost too powerful. One of Parmenides' fragments reads, «Το γάρ αυτό νοήν εστίν τε και είναι», for the same perceiving, thinking, as well as being. Different things, thinking and being, are here thought of as the same. What does this say? It says something wholly different from what we know otherwise as the doctrine of metaphysics, which states that identity belongs to being. Parmenides says, being belongs to an identity. What does identity mean here? What does the word to afto the same say in Parmenides' fragment? Parmenides gives us no answer. He places us before an enigma which we may not sidestep. We must acknowledge the fact that in the earliest period of thinking, long before thinking had arrived at a principle of identity, identity itself speaks out in a pronouncement which rules as follows. Thinking and being belong together in the same. And by virtue of this same, unintentionally, we have here already interpreted to afto the same. We interpret sameness to mean a belonging together. The obvious thing to do would be to represent this belonging together in the sense of identity as it was thought and generally understood later on. What could prevent us? None other than the principle itself which we read in Parmenides. For it says something else. It says that being, together with thinking, belongs in the same. Being is determined by an identity as a characteristic of that identity. Later on, however, identity, as it is thought of in metaphysics, is represented as a characteristic of being. Thus, we must not try to determine the identity that Parmenides speaks of in terms of this metaphysically represented identity. The sameness of thinking and being that speaks in Parmenides' fragment stems from further back than the kind of identity defined by metaphysics in terms of being as a characteristic of being. The key word in Parmenides' fragment, to auto, the same, remains obscure. We shall leave it obscure, but we shall at the same time take a hint from the sentence that begins with this key word. But meanwhile, we have already fixed the same of thinking and being as the belonging together of the two. That was rash, perhaps of necessity. We must repair that rashness, and we can do so since we do not consider the belonging together of which we have spoken as the ultimate or even the only authoritative interpretation of the sameness of thinking and being. If we think of belonging together in the customary way, the meaning of belonging is determined by the word together, that is, by its unity. In that case, to belong means as much as to be assigned and placed into the order of a together, established in the unity of a manifold, combined into the unity of a system, mediated by the unifying center of an authoritative synthesis. Philosophy represents this belonging together as nexus and connexio, the necessary connection of the one with the other. However, belonging together can also be thought of as belonging together. This means the together is now determined by the belonging. Of course, we must still ask here what belong means in that case, and how its peculiar together is determined only in its terms. The answer to these questions is closer to us than we imagine, but it is not obvious. Enough for now that this reference makes us note the possibility of no longer representing belonging in terms of the unity of the together, but rather of experiencing this together in terms of belonging. However, does not the reference to this possibility amount to no more than an empty play on words, an artifice without support in verifiable facts? That is how things look until we take a closer look and let the matter speak for itself. The idea of belonging together in the sense of a belonging together arises in respect of a situation which has already been mentioned. That situation is, of course, difficult to keep in mind because it is so simple, but it comes closer to us just as soon as we pay heed to the following. In the interpretation of belonging together as belonging together, we, taking Parmenides' hint, already had in mind thinking as well as being, and thus what belongs to each other in the same.
Hate to interrupt, but we would be remiss to not share an advertisement from our sponsors. And we're not sponsored by any corporate or state entities other than ourselves. So I'll just tell you a little bit about some of the past courses and the ongoing courses here at TU. Because If any of them sound exciting to you, well, you can access all of them by becoming a subscriber. That's right, subscribers make all of this possible. Subscribers get access to the course I taught on Martin Heidegger's Being and Time, as well as the course that I taught the first half of last year, Emmanuel Levinas's Totality and Infinity, the second half for which I will be teaching this winter. I've also taught critical media theory and critical doxology and Timenergy with my wife, Ann Snellgrove McKerracher, who is the co-host on What's Right. Also, you would get access to the course I taught at the university, 3 semesters worth, on Intro to Critical Social Theory and Socioanalysis. But also, we've had lots of other great professors teach Introduction to Marxism by Chris Catrone, Intro to Lacan via Seminar 11 with Todd McGowan, Introduction to Ivan Illich with Brian Weeks, The Clinical Structures of Psychoanalysis and Autism with Dr. Leon Brenner, the Michael Downs Seminar, Introduction to Slavoj Žižek, Introduction to Nick Land, and Žižek's For They Know Not What They Do, all taught by Michael Downs, as well as What is Sex? There was a collab that I did with Cadell Last, Theory 101, a collab I did with Hello Gorgias. And then also, of course, there's Carl Jaspers' The Idea of the University, PMC Consciousness and Ideology. These were early, very important courses that I taught with friends at TU back in 2023. And they remain important to this day. Every one of these courses comes out of an overarching research project. There's a real driving force, mission, and agenda to the research going on at TU because we want to understand the situation for the sake of large-scale structural change focused on the good life. What does that actually mean? If you really want to go deep, obviously, these courses are something you could spend the better part of a year binging while at work. Ongoing courses that come out on a monthly basis are the Fundamental Problems and Core Concepts at TU with yours truly, also my seminar, Philosophy of Nature with Nina Power, the Benjamin Studebaker seminar, as well as his course, The 12 Political Theorists. We've got some really exciting stuff coming down the line. The only way to make this all possible and really deepen your knowledge and familiarity with all of these different things is to become a subscriber today at http://theoryunderground.com/subscribe. Thank you.
When we understand thinking to be the distinctive characteristic of man, we remind ourselves of a belonging together that concerns man and being. Immediately, we find ourselves grappling with the questions. What does being mean? Who or what is man? Everybody can see easily that without a sufficient answer to these questions, we lack the foundation for determining anything reliable about the belonging together of man and being. But as long as we ask our questions in this way, we are confined within the attempt to represent the together of man and being as a coordination, and to establish and explain this coordination either in terms of man or in terms of being. In this procedure, the traditional concepts of man and being constitute the toehold for the coordination of the two. How would it be if, instead of tenaciously representing merely a coordination of the two in order to produce their unity, we were for once to note whether and how a belonging to one another first of all is at stake in this together? There is even the possibility that we might catch sight of the belonging together of man and being, though only from afar, already in the traditional definitions of their essence. How so? Man obviously is a being. As such, he belongs to the totality of being, just like the stone, the tree, or the eagle. To belong here still means to be in the order of being. But man's distinctive feature lies in this, that he, as the being who thinks, is open to being, face to face with being. Thus man remains referred to being and so answers to it. Man is essentially this relationship of responding to being, and he's only this. This only does not mean a limitation, but rather an excess, a belonging. To being prevails within man, a belonging. which listens to being because it is appropriated to being. And being, let us think of being according to its original meaning, as presence. Being is present to man neither incidentally nor only on rare occasions. Being is present and abides only as it concerns man through the claim it makes on him. For it is man open toward being, who alone lets being arrive as presence. Such becoming present needs the openness of a clearing, and by this need remains appropriated to human being. This does not at all mean that being is posited first and only by man. On the contrary, the following becomes clear. Man and being are appropriated to each other. They belong to each other. From this belonging to each other, which has not been thought out more closely, man and being have first received those determinations of essence by which man and being are grasped metaphysically in philosophy. We stubbornly misunderstand this prevailing belonging together of man and being as long as we represent everything only in categories and mediations, be it with or without dialectic. Then we always find only connections that are established either in terms of being or in terms of man, and that present the belonging together of man and being as an intertwining. We do not as yet enter the domain of the belonging together. How can such an entry come about? By our moving away from the attitude of representational thinking. This move is a leap in the sense of a spring. The spring leaps away from the habitual idea of man as the rational animal who in modern times has become a subject for his objects. Simultaneously, the spring also leaps away from being. But being, since the beginning of Western thought, has been interpreted as the ground in which every being as such is grounded. Where does the spring go that springs away from the ground? Into an abyss? Yes, as long as we only represent the spring in the horizon of metaphysical thinking. No, insofar as we spring and let go. Where to? To where we already have access, the belonging to being. Being itself, however, belongs to us, for only with us can being be present as being, that is, become present. Thus, a spring is needed in order to experience authentically the belonging together to being. This spring is the abruptness of the unbridged entry into that belonging, which alone can grant a toward each other of man and being, and thus the constellation of the two. The spring is the abrupt entry into the realm from which man and being have already reached each other in their active nature, since both are mutually appropriated, extended as a gift one to the other. Only the entry into the realm of this mutual appropriation determines and defines the experience of thinking. What a curious leap, presumably yielding us the insight that we do not reside sufficiently as yet, where in reality we already are. Where are we? In what constellation of being and man? Today we no longer need complicated directives, as we did some years ago, to catch sight of the constellation by virtue of which man and being concern each other, or so it seems. It is enough, one would think, to say the words atomic age in order to let us experience how being becomes present to us today in the world of technology. But may we simply equate the world of technology with being? Obviously not. Not even if we imagine this world as the totality in which atomic energy, the calculating plans of man and automation are conjoined. Why does such a directive concerning the world of technology, even if it were the most circumstantial description, never let us catch sight of the constellation of being and man? because every analysis of the situation falls in its thinking short of the mark, in that the above-mentioned totality of the world of technology is interpreted in advance in terms of man as being of man's making. Technology, conceived in the broadest sense and in its manifold manifestations, is taken for the plan which man projects, the plan which finally compels man to decide whether he will become the servant of his plan or will remain its master. By this conception of the totality of the technological world, we reduce everything down to man, and at best come to the point of calling for an ethics of the technological world. Caught up in this conception, we confirm our own opinion that technology is of man's making alone. We fail to hear the claim of being which speaks in the essence of technology. Let us at long last stop conceiving technology as something purely technical, that is, in terms of man and his machines. Let us listen to the claim placed in our age not only upon man, but also upon all beings, nature and history with regard to their being. What claim do we have in mind? Our whole human existence everywhere sees itself challenged, now playfully and now urgently, now breathlessly and now ponderously, to devote itself to the planning and calculating of everything. What speaks in this challenge? Does it stem merely from man's spontaneous whim, or are we here already concerned with beings themselves in such a way that they make a claim on us with respect to their aptness to be planned and calculated? Is it that being itself is faced with the challenge of letting beings appear within the horizon of what is calculable? Indeed. And not only this, to the same degree that being is challenged, man too is challenged, that is, forced to secure all beings that are his concern as the substance for his planning and calculating, and to carry this manipulation on past all bounds. The name for the gathering of this challenge, which places man and being face to face in such a way that they challenge each other by turns, is the framework, that in which and from which man and being are of concern to each other in the technological world, claims us in the manner of the framework. In the mutual confrontation of man and being, we discern the claim that determines the constellation of our age. The framework concerns us everywhere, immediately. The frame, if we may still speak in this manner, is more real than all of atomic energy and the whole world of machinery, more real than the driving power of organization, communications, and automation, because we no longer encounter what is called the frame within the purview of representation, which lets us think the being of beings as presence. The frame no longer concerns us as something that is present. Therefore, the frame seems at first strange. It remains strange above all because it is not an ultimate, but rather first gives us that which prevails throughout the constellation of being and man. The belonging together of man and being in the manner of mutual challenge drives home to us with startling force that and how man is delivered over to the ownership of being, and being is appropriate to the essence of man. Within the framework there prevails a strange ownership and a strange appropriation. We must experience simply this owning in which man and being are delivered over to each other. That is, we must enter into what we call the event of appropriation. The words event of appropriation, thought of in terms of the matter indicated, should now speak as a key term in the service of thinking. As such a key term, it can no more be translated than the Greek logos or the Chinese Tao. The term event of appropriation here no longer means what we would otherwise call a happening, an occurrence. It now is used as a singular tantum. What it indicates happens only in the singular, no, not in any number, but uniquely. What we experience in the frame as the constellation of being and man through the modern world of technology is a prelude to what is called the event of appropriation. This event, however, does not necessarily persist in its prelude, for in the event of appropriation, the possibility arises that it may overcome the mere dominance of the frame, to turn it into a more original appropriating. Such a transformation of the frame into the event of appropriation, by virtue of that event, would bring the appropriate recovery, appropriate, hence never to be produced by man alone, of the world of technology, from its dominance back to servitude in the realm by which man reaches more truly into the event of appropriation. Where are we now? At the entry of our thinking into that simplicity which we call, in the strict sense of the term, the event of appropriation. It seems as if we were now in danger of directing our thinking all too carelessly towards something that is remote and general, while in fact what the term event of appropriation wishes to indicate really speaks to us directly from the very nearness of that neighborhood in which we already reside. For what could be closer to us than what brings us nearer to where we belong, to where we are belongers, to the event of appropriation? The event of appropriation is that realm vibrating within itself, through which man and being reach each other in their nature, achieve their active nature by losing those qualities with which metaphysics has endowed them. To think of appropriating as the event of appropriation means to contribute to this self-vibrating realm. Thinking receives the tools for this self-suspended structure from language. For language is the most delicate and thus the most susceptible vibration, holding everything within the suspended structure of the appropriation. We dwell in the appropriation inasmuch as our active nature is given over to language. We have now reached a point on our path where we must ask the crude but inevitable question: what does appropriation have to do with identity? Answer: nothing. Identity, on the other hand, has much, perhaps everything, to do with appropriation. How so? We can answer this question by retracing our path in a few steps. The appropriation appropriates man and being to their essential togetherness. In the frame, we glimpse a first oppressing flash of the appropriation. The frame constitutes the active nature of the modern world of technology. In the frame, we witness a belonging together of man and being, in which the letting belong first determines the manner of the together and its unity. We let Parmenides' fragment, "For the same are thinking as well as being," introduce us to the question of a belonging together in which belonging has precedence over together. The question of the now breathlessly and now ponderously to devote itself to the planning and calculating of everything. What speaks in this challenge? Does it stem merely from man's spontaneous whim, or are we here already concerned with beings themselves in such a way that they make a claim on us with respect to their aptness to be planned and calculated? Is it that being itself is faced with the challenge of letting beings appear within the horizon of what is calculable? Indeed, and not only this, to the same degree that being is challenged, man too is challenged, that is, forced to secure all beings that are his concern as the substance for his planning and calculating, and to carry this manipulation on past all bounds. The name for the gathering of this challenge, which places man and being face to face in such a way that they challenge each other by turns, is the framework, that in which and from which man and being are of concern to each other in the technological world, claims us in the manner of the framework. In the mutual confrontation of man and being, we discern the claim that determines the constellation of our age. The framework concerns us everywhere, immediately. The frame, if we may still speak in this manner, is more real than all of atomic energy and the whole world of machinery, more real than the driving power of organization, communications, and automation, because we no longer encounter what is called the frame within the purview of representation, which lets us think the being of beings as presence. The frame no longer concerns us as something that is present. Therefore, the frame seems at first strange. It remains strange above all, because it is not an ultimate, but rather first gives us that which prevails throughout the constellation of being and man. The belonging together of man and being in the manner of mutual challenge drives home to us with startling force that and how man is delivered over to the ownership of being, and being is appropriate to the essence of man. Within the framework there prevails a strange ownership and a strange appropriation. We must experience simply this owning in which man and being are delivered over to each other. That is, we must enter into what we call the event of appropriation. The words event of appropriation, thought of in terms of the matter indicated, should now speak as a key term in the service of thinking. As such a key term, it can no more be translated than the Greek logos or the Chinese Tao. The term event of appropriation here no longer means what we would otherwise call a happening, an occurrence. It now is used as a singular tantum. What it indicates happens only in the singular. No, not in any number, but uniquely. What we experience in the frame, as the constellation of being and man through the modern world of technology, is a prelude to what is called the event of appropriation. This event, however, does not necessarily persist in its prelude, for in the event of appropriation, the possibility arises that it may overcome the mere dominance of the frame to turn it into a more original appropriating. Such a transformation of the frame into the event of appropriation, by virtue of that event, would bring the appropriate recovery, appropriate, hence never to be produced by man alone, of the world of technology from its dominance back to servitude in the realm by which man reaches more truly into the event of appropriation. Where are we now? At the entry of our thinking into that simplicity which we call in the strict sense of the term the event of appropriation. It seems as if we were now in danger of directing our thinking all too carelessly towards something that is remote and general, while in fact what the term event of appropriation wishes to indicate really speaks to us directly from the very nearness of that neighborhood in which we already reside. For what could be closer to us than what brings us nearer to where we belong, to where we are belongers, to the event of appropriation? The event of appropriation is that realm vibrating within itself, through which man and being reach each other in their nature, achieve their active nature by losing those qualities with which metaphysics has endowed them. To think of appropriating as the event of appropriation means to contribute to this self-vibrating realm. Thinking receives the tools for this self-suspended structure from language, for language is the most delicate and thus the most susceptible vibration, holding everything within the suspended structure of the appropriation. We dwell in the appropriation inasmuch as our active nature is given over to language. We have now reached a point on our path where we must ask the crude but inevitable question: what does appropriation have to do with identity? Answer: nothing. Identity, on the other hand, has much, perhaps everything, to do with appropriation. How so? We can answer this question by retracing our path in a few steps. The appropriation appropriates man and being to their essential togetherness. In the frame, we glimpse a first oppressing flash of the appropriation. The frame constitutes the active nature of the modern world of technology. In the frame, we witness a belonging together of man and being, in which the letting belong first determines the manner of the together and its unity. We let Parmenides' fragment, "For the same are thinking as well as being," introduce us to the question of a belonging together in which belonging has precedence over together. The question of the meaning of this same is the question of the active nature of identity. The doctrine of metaphysics represents identity as a fundamental characteristic of being. Now it becomes clear that being belongs with thinking to an identity whose active essence stems from that letting belong together, which we call the appropriation. The essence of identity is a property of the event of appropriation. If the attempt to guide our thinking to the abode of the essential origin of identity is to some extent tenable, what would have become of the title of our lecture? The meaning of the title, "The Principle of Identity," would have undergone a transformation. The law appears at first in the form of a fundamental principle which presupposes identity as a characteristic of being, that is, of the ground of beings. This principle, in the sense of a statement, has in the meantime become a principle bearing the characteristics of a spring that departs from being as the ground of beings, and thus springs into the abyss. But this abyss is neither empty nothingness nor murky confusion, but rather the event of appropriation. In the event of appropriation vibrates the active nature of what speaks as language, which at one time was called the house of being. Principle of identity means now a spring demanded by the essence of identity, because it needs that spring if the belonging together of man and being is to attain the essential light of the appropriation. On its way from the principle as a statement about identity to the principle as a spring into the essential origin of identity, thinking has undergone a transformation. Thus, looking toward the present beyond the situation of man, thinking sees the constellation of being and man in terms of that which joins the two by virtue of the event of appropriation. Assuming we could look forward to the possibility that the mutual challenge of man and being to enter the calculation of what is calculable, were to address itself to us as the event of appropriation which first surrenders man and being to their own being, then a path would be open for man to experience beings in a more originary way, the totality of the modern technological world, nature and history, and above all, their being. As long as reflection on the world of the atomic age, however, earnestly and responsibly strives for no more than the peaceful use of atomic energy, and also will not be content with any other goal, thinking stops halfway. Such halfwayness only secures the technological world all the more in its metaphysical predominance. But what authority has decided that nature as such must forever remain the nature of modern physics, and that history must forever appear only as subject matter for historians? We cannot, of course, reject today's technological world as devil's work, nor may we destroy it, assuming it does not destroy itself. Still less may we cling to the view that the world of technology is such that it will absolutely prevent a spring out of it. For this view is obsessed by the latest news and regards them as the only thing that is real. This view is indeed fantastical, but the same is not true of a thinking ahead, looking toward that which approaches us as the call of the active nature of identity between man and being. Thinking has needed more than 2,000 years, really, to understand such a simple relation as that of the mediation within identity. Do we then have a right to the opinion that the thinking entry into the essential source of identity could be achieved in a day? Precisely because this entry requires a spring, it must take take its time, the time of thinking, which is different from the time of calculation that pulls our thinking in all directions. Today, the computer calculates thousands of relationships in 1 second. Despite their technical uses, they are inessential. Whatever and however we may try to think, we think within the sphere of tradition. Tradition prevails when it frees us from thinking back to a thinking forward, which is no longer a planning. Only when we turn thoughtfully toward what has already been thought will we be turned to use for what must still be thought.
Subscribers get access to all past courses at Theory Underground, from Chris Catrone to Michael Downs, as well as ongoing courses taught by David McKerracher, Benjamin Studebaker, and Nina Power. Subscribers also get access to monthly research seminars, and the higher tiers of involvement unlock discussions and one-on-one small group tutelage. So if you're like me and you're never a huge bookish kind of person, but somewhere along the way you got really into listening to educational materials, if you got really into listening to podcasts and then books at work, if you love going deep into ideas, but you're just not a traditional bookish kind of person, well, this is where the alliance between people like us and people who are more bookish and specialized are able to meet, to work through these things, and do so in defense of the human, in defense of our dignity, in defense of our common humanity and our intellectual integrity. This is not a place where we're going to kick you out because you're pro-life or pro-choice, or where you are an atheist or a agnostic or a Christian. But it is a place where you're expected to love one another regardless of such things, and to show up for people in your actual IRL real life communities regardless of such things. And if that is exciting for you, and if you're excited to learn about what this approach, this method, this school of thought has to offer, then I'm excited to meet you. Subscribe today. Thank you.